So what are the archaeological stories of the My Castle Gateway area?
Well, the Castle Gateway area tells pretty well every single archaeological story from the history of York. We know a lot of detail about some of those, we know less about others. So we have a section of the Viking city that the Jorvik Viking Centre retells in a high level of detail that came from the Coppergate excavations that were undertaken at the end of the 1970s. We have a Norman castle, now represented by the motte on which the later medieval Clifford's Tower sits. We have the later prison buildings, and what's left of the prison complex there is sitting behind it where the courts now are in the Castle Museum. So those are some of the periods, but in between those periods there are obviously everything else that was happening. And the really important thing about the whole Castle Gateway area is where it sits in the city. It sits at the point where the Ouse and Foss, the two rivers that run through York, meet. And it's basically at the launch point into the rest of the world, and it's how the rest of the world came to the city and would have entered the city of York. It's how goods and people and ideas would have flowed between the two. The Vikings would have called it a ness, would have understood it as a promontory into a seaway, not just physical movement of water, but that movement of trade and ideas, that conceptual seaway as well. And that's very much how I understand the area. In other words, it's critically important. The Ouse, for many centuries, was how you came to York. I personally think the Foss is why you stopped here, because you could come up the Foss, you could berth, you could dock, you could unload. And therefore where Castle Gateway sits is a key point of control. So that's why the Normans put a castle there. It stands to reason, really. It's why people chose to live there in earlier periods, because they wanted to be near where things were happening. My personal interest is in the Anglian period, or the Anglo-Saxon period. And I find it hard to believe that there's nothing underneath the Norman castle. I think there must be something underneath the Norman castle. We have had hints of possible Anglo period settlement and burial in this area. We know from just slightly further downstream, we've got the site of the Anglian Wick, the trading settlement that would have been the commercial and hub of the Anglian settlement of York in the 7th and 8th centuries. And research done in the city over the last 40 years has suggested very strongly that evidence for this period lies in those river corridors coming up the Ouse and coming up the Foss. One of the wonderful things about the archaeology in this area, as is demonstrated so fantastically at Jorvik, is because the depth of the archaeological deposits and the condition of them, that they're waterlogged and therefore anaerobic, you get astounding survival of materials that would otherwise completely disappear. Textiles, timbers, all the organic stuff that normally doesn't survive. And you also get the amazing environmental evidence, so insects and seeds and pollen, all the things that can tell you about the environment in which people live and how they influence that environment to a spectacular level of detail that you wouldn't get elsewhere. And we know that these conditions pertain in the Castle Gateway area. It is a stunning resource. So, for me, the Anglian period is, in many ways, the highlight of York's story. It's the point where, for several hundred years, York is the ecclesiastical heart of the Kingdom of Northumbria. It's the origin of Alcuin, one of the greatest scholars in the medieval world. It's the location of a very famous library that we think the Vikings may have destroyed. It's a terrific place. It's a centre for learning. The Emperor Charlemagne picked Alcuin out of York and took him away to the continent to teach him and to educate his clerics and to educate his people. And what's so frustrating is that there's so little of Anglian York left for us to see, because a lot of it is ephemeral. A lot of it is buried very deeply, and as I've said, it seems inconceivable to me that high quality evidence for this period would not survive in the deep and waterlogged conditions in the Castle Gateway area. In many ways, I think the very heart of the city itself.
What would you like to be able to do in the area in the future?
Well, if it was purely up to me, I would like to dig a very large hole, like most archaeologists, to get down into this material and recover some of this amazing information. And I hope very much that archaeological investigation will be part of any project or activity that takes place in the area. But I think more importantly, because archaeology is about people and places are about people, and the place that is the Castle Gateway, has an opportunity to reinvent itself, I would want very much to work with the communities of York to investigate that past, and I would like that to include excavation, but it can also include other types of research, particularly archive work, and work with the people of York to actually tell their own story. I think that would be a very powerful legacy from any activity undertaken here. And also, I'd like to see the space. I mean, the space is already historically superb with Clifford's Tower and with the Castle Museum and with the Jorvik Viking Centre, but it also has, and I'm going to speak personally here, it has a very large car park which is not particularly attractive and is difficult to walk across and makes the area feel a little bit unfriendly. And I think if we're going to reinvigorate the place, I think we have to get rid of the cars and get the people back into Castle Piccadilly.
What matters about the Castle Gateway area?
Well, speaking for myself and speaking for the Jorvik group of attractions and events, I suppose really I associate that area most strongly with the finale for the Jorvik Viking Festival, which is York's annual celebration of its Viking heritage and culture. So the area around Clifford's Tower and particularly the Eye of York has in the past been an arena on which various spectacular events have played out. Often this is on the final Saturday of the festival when we stage a battle, and these have in the past taken place in the afternoon and in the evening. So hundreds of reenactors will gather at the Eye of York and stage. They will reenact a Viking era battle for an audience. So this is something that I've been a part of, certainly while I've worked for the Jorvik group, so for the last 10 years or so, and that's always really in my mind whenever I pass through that area. As well as the reenactment, we have had firework displays there as part of the finale event. So light and sound displays, fireworks, fire sculptures. The fireworks have been launched from the top of the Castle Museum. They've also been launched from Clifford's Tower. And this has produced some quite spectacular moments really for the end of the Jorvik Viking Festival. In years gone by, the river was used more so than it is now. So we've had regattas, Viking ships on the river. I believe also, although this is before my time, that there was a boat burning near Skeldergate Bridge, so that hasn't happened within the last sort of 15 years or so, but I understand it did take place in the past. So for me, I think of the area really as an arena or a venue, a potential venue for events. They already happen there. The potential for them to be so much bigger and so much more spectacular, I think, is really opened up when you start to imagine the different public spaces linked up more and less split apart by car parks and roads, etc.
What would you like to be able to do in the future in the Castle Gateway area?
I do like the idea of a space that's more open for events and spectacles. I like the idea of a more wide open public space, a linked space that people can use for whatever they want really. From an interpretation point of view, it would be nice to see a design for the area incorporating some thinking around how the medieval history and earlier, so possibly from the Roman period onwards or from prehistory onwards, how that is interpreted for the public. So it would be good that be given consideration from the get-go really, because as we know, the area has a great deal of inherent interest and certain stories that I don't think have been told in any great detail for general audiences. So maybe the story of Greyfriars, for instance, which stands against the river. Those sorts of stories might be usefully explored.